So, thank you for joining me this morning to talk about your book. We're going to be talking about Regina's book on Irene Tasker, her life and work with the Alexander technique, which was published in 2020, and there's now a second edition in paperback, 2022. It's available from the Moritz website. Regina is an Alexander teacher, trained in London, qualified in 2014, and returned to her native Austria 4 years later. In that 4 years in London, she was working part of the time with the Walter Carrington archive. So, Regina, before you came across Irene Tasker's notebook in the archive, had you heard of her, and did you know about her role in the history of the technique?
Yes, I had heard about her, but my impression of her was, I suppose, more like that she was kind of a secretary, an assistant, but in the role of a secretary. So I certainly wasn't aware of the all her achievements and the role she actually played in this early period of the Alexander technique. I had read the biography by Michael Block. I had read Connecting Links, although I didn't maybe understand certain things also for lack of context. Yeah, so I didn't know what an amazing woman, amazing teacher she was.
So when you found the book, you decided to transcribe it. Is that right?
So I was a fairly newly qualified teacher and working for the Walter Carrington Educational Trust. I was an admin there, and I was also asked to help with the archives, so to look through material, to catalog material, so to input some basic information into a database. I came across this notebook which was labeled Irene Tasker. So it's handwritten, loose pages in a ring binder, and was intrigued because I knew that Irene Tasker was part of an inner circle around Alexander. So I thought, okay, I want to read this. That was not part of my job to read it or to transcribe it. So I was curious, and I was hoping that there would be something in there that might help me as a teacher. So I read it, I transcribed it, and then I thought that's actually quite interesting because I realized it was notes from her visits to Alexander's first training course, notes of lessons she had with Alexander. So I thought that should be made more widely available. So I went to Jean Fischer and I asked him, shouldn't this be published? And he thought that yes, but maybe I could collect a little bit of information about her life. Maybe I could just write up a little biographical note. Maybe I could do a few interviews with people who still met her. And so I did that. I started doing that, and then material started to appear. So it really got a bit out of hand. And of course, there's more. There's quite a bit of material from Irene Tasker in the Walter archive. There's a big collection of letters, for example, she received from Alexander during my research. So I got to know Irene Tasker's handwriting really well, so I could identify another notebook in the archive as hers. And of course, both those notebooks are published in full in the book as well.
But you say on the book cover that the biography is based upon research and study of primary sources. So yeah. You added to the notebooks, you were mentioning that you did interviews. Could you tell us a little bit about that process?
I'll say something about primary sources. So primary and secondary sources in historical research. And primary sources are those which are either from people who were directly involved in the event or are directly from the time. So, for example, the notebooks are primary sources because that's Irene Tasker herself writing down her impressions at the moment. Or letters around a certain event, that's primary sources. And also interviews, of course, with people who were part of certain events or who knew people. So that's valuable information to be gotten. And it was also a very enjoyable process, really, to interview colleagues and pupils and family members as well.
Yes, so there are several teachers who remember Irene from the 70s. And yes, I was very interested to read about how you got to know the family. It was amazing that there were so many people around who still had material from Irene. Could you tell us how you got in touch with the family?
That was very lucky. So there was nobody could tell me a contact. So nobody I was in touch with had any contact with the family or knew how to contact them. So I did an internet research. I knew a little bit already. I did an internet research, and I found an article in an Indian online newspaper of two siblings, two girls who were traveling in India, researching family history. And that was Irene Tasker's brother, Theodore Tasker. And so I contacted those two young women, and luckily an answer came back then from their mother, who was very interested. So that was how I found the family. And luckily, the family is very lovely. So they were very interested to speak to me, and they were very happy that somebody is interested in a favorite aunt. They themselves weren't so aware of the big role that Irene Tasker played in the Alexander technique world. But they were very helpful, which is not, one cannot rely on this as a researcher. I was very lucky that they came to trust me. So of course they invited me, then I interviewed a family member, got to know other family members. They had two boxes with material from Irene Tasker, a box with books of hers and a box with papers. So there were some amazing treasures in there, letters, certificates, Irene Tasker's certificate from Alexander, also her Montessori certificate, and other papers. So that was extremely helpful, and was very lucky that the family was so interested and supportive, and also gave permission, to use material to publish Irene's writings.
Irene's brother, is it Theodore?
Yeah.
Yes, and so it was his family. I just was wondering about the generations, the people you contacted.
They were great grandnieces. So right. Theodore was Irene's brother. Then, yes. His son was the father of the family member Kate, with whom I then was first mostly in contact. So to her, Irene Tasker was a great aunt. And to those girls I contacted first, she was a great grand aunt, or how do you say that in English? Yeah, but there were some siblings, so I had a nice exchange with several family members. And during the research, then I also got in contact with other branches of the family.
Can you talk a little bit about how historical research and making sense of data differs from the kind of research that one would do where you design an experiment and then collect data and analyze it?
Obviously, with historical research, usually you don't quite know what you will get. So what kind of, you can't design it so much. So you collect what you can. In my case, this was looking through material in this archive, in the Walter Carrington archive, in other collections, doing those interviews. Then you get new leads, basically, so where you can follow up again. Also obviously also reading secondary literature, like, for example, Michael Bloch's biography or other historic or other writing around events this time. So you collect information and you have to evaluate the sources. So are the primary sources are more valuable, more reliable usually? Take the context into consideration, possible biases maybe also. So then you compare also sources, put things in chronological order. If you write the biography, you have the facts, but you have to interpret the facts, or you have to find the story in the facts.
So there's a certain amount of creativeness in the process. How do you ensure that your imagination doesn't take over from the actual factual material that's in front of you?
Yeah, that's something to be mindful of also, because obviously the interpretation that oneself can make of the facts is always through one's own lens somehow. So that you have to be mindful of your own potential bias.
Yes, it's interesting that when you're living with somebody to that extent, reading about them and talking about them, that you get a sense that you actually did meet them and knew them yourself, and you almost get into their minds, what they would be thinking and what they would do next.
You get a sense of a person also. You sort of get to know them. But it's also important, I think, to get to know the context, that the time in which they were operating. So it was quite a revelation for me, for example, to learn more, although I sort of knew, but not very well, to learn more about the situation of women also during the time when Irene Tasker was born and growing up. So
the society was very different, and women's place in society and expectations were very different to what they are today.
Absolutely, yeah. Women were just expected to be in the home, to manage the home. And so it was quite a new thing that women would go out and have a career, have a professional life. Women didn't have the vote at that time. So the first bit, and that was not all, was 1918 in the UK. But
yes, you can't imagine it nowadays. Education was one of the very few professions that women could actually go into.
Yeah, that was expected.
That's what Irene did to begin with. She was the governess or teacher, wasn't she, to a family?
Yeah, well, she had an academic education, so that's also remarkable. So she was allowed. That was not usual as well. At that time, she was allowed to go to university. She studied at Girton, classics.
Yes, that's important to know, isn't it, that she went to Girton?
Yeah. But she was drawn towards progressive education. So she became governess of Lady Margaretnberg of a little homeschool, who was also, I think, quite influential. She was a very progressive feminist, so to say. I mean, a feminist of the time. And she was interested in Montessori also, so that Irene Tasker was able to go to this first Montessori teacher training in Rome by Maria Montessori herself.
And that's where she met Ethel Webb.
Exactly.
And the rest is history.
Ethel Webb and Margaretnberg.
I think Margaretnberg also was introduced to Alexander through Ethel.
Yes, Ethel Webb was an assistant of Alexander at the time already. And she introduced Irene Tasker and Margaretnberg to the Alexander technique. So she gave them, I think it was Conscious Control, wasn't it? This first little booklet.
I think so, yes, the 1912, yes.
Yeah, and maybe just to give context, also Margaretnberg later on was important to bring Alexander to New York. So she didn't train as a teacher. She didn't become an Alexander teacher, but she was quite an important influence in that sense that she brought Alexander to, and Irene Tasker also in a way, to New York. And so this way the Alexander technique in the States started.
From that, there were enormous influences, particularly in the United States, with progressive education. And as you say, with the whole movement to liberate women from their traditional roles.
Yes, it's interesting that those very strong and independent women were also sort of gathering around Alexander. So I think there's also has been a little bit of a not quite right impression there. So those were not just like adoring groupies, but those were like really the progressive independent women of their time who were making their own path. So they were breaking out of the traditional mold of being in the home and finding, like what they wanted to do. And they were drawn to the Alexander technique and gathering around Alexander, who accepted them and who supported them.
So how did the writing process and the process of analyzing work together?
Yeah, it was not such a divided process. So during the process of writing, I found out that actually writing is helpful for me to think better. So it would be a process of a lot of writing, then reading, thinking about it again, rewriting. New material might come to light in the meantime, or I would want to find out something more. So it was not, like first the collecting, then the analyzing, and then the writing, but it was much more of a connected process of a constant rereading and rewriting also.
Yeah, so the book itself, the form, would have grown organically almost as you collected more evidence.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
then so did that affect the structure of the book? Did it change much from your original conception?
Yeah, it changed a lot. It changed a lot. My original conception was very simple because I thought, like I wasn't aware that there is so much material to be found, really. That was a little bit overwhelming almost at times, how much actually was there. So that the original plan was very simple. And while the book took shape and while I got to know Irene Tasker better and also the situation better, it became clear to me that I wanted the book to be quite serious in a way, like almost a bit academic. I mean, it's not, was not affiliated to any institution, but I wanted to include a lot of the source material as much as possible in full. Also to make it easier for other researchers or people who want to like get more context. So not to just give a quote from a source, but wherever possible to include the whole letter, to include a whole text, give a lot of references. So it's also one can know how I came to a conclusion, maybe. Yeah, so that became important for me to.
So that readers can take up where you left off, or to look at certain things more deeply and make their own conclusions about things, rather than just relying on what your interpretation was.
Absolutely, yeah.
And did you find that you got most of the letters and material that was existent in?
Unfortunately not. I mean, so there's still was unfortunately not able to travel everywhere where it would have been, good to go myself. I mean, I was very lucky. I was incredibly lucky with many people being very supportive and providing me with information or access to their private research or their own collection and so on. So, for example, the South African Society of Teachers of the Alexander Technique, they have a little archive with letters which Irene Tasker sent to Joyce Roberts. Joyce Roberts was Irene Tasker's assistant, who later on sought recognition as a teacher and trained herself some teachers. So they were able to scan letters for me and send me the scans, which was extremely helpful. But of course, would have been good to go myself and see what other material there is, and also to see what else is there in South Africa, because it was huge. I mean, at a certain time before the South African libel case, the intention of certain people to bring the Alexander Technique into the educational system. And after the South African libel case, it all went quiet. So I wonder, I think there might still be stuff to discover there. And yeah, I wasn't able to go. Also, there are letters in New York, and I unfortunately wasn't able to go there. So there's possibly still something to discover. And yeah, I mean, there's other university archives also in the States where I thought, who knows? But yeah, so there is still, I also would like to maybe use this opportunity to encourage other people in the community to get curious and on the one hand, maybe write down their own memories of their training, maybe, but also to not be shy to get curious. And it's incredibly rewarding. I mean, it's also for me as a teacher was very inspiring and rewarding. So
good. And that what I was going to ask you what the most enjoyable aspect of the whole project had been.
Yeah, there have been many enjoyable aspects. For the one, on the one hand, for example, contact with people. I really enjoyed meeting people, like the family. That was so exciting. And body interviews I did, all the contact with colleagues I had who were interested and supportive. So that was all very enjoyable. And also making discoveries, that was very exciting. And yeah, also seeing how my picture of Irene Tasker changed from sort of having a fuzzy idea that she was part of this inner circle, and then,
Yes, I get the impression that she was quite a jolly person, very serious, but also she was great fun.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, she was obviously very principled and very dedicated to the Alexander Technique, but she seemed to have been good company also and liked camping. And if you read the Alexander Times, the magazine she did with the children of the little school, also I think one gets an impression of how much the children enjoyed being there. It's really colorful and interesting. Yeah.
Were there any particular light bulb moments in the whole project?
Yeah, There were several, many light bulb moments, smaller ones and bigger ones. Bigger light bulb moments were, for example, finding a copy of a letter Irene Tasker sent to Alexander, where she expressed her discontent with how things were going with the little school. So, which certainly was an aspect of her then leaving and going to South Africa. So that was, I think, and that's an important document. I think this letter also then in South Africa, obviously discovering what she achieved there.
Yes, in just a few years, she had that enormous movement going that were wanting to open training courses and introduce the work into schools.
Yeah,
so
also
she was really quite a remarkable woman.
She was a remarkable individual, really, but especially as a woman of her time. Another very important, very interesting document, I think, is this South African memorandum, where supporters of Irene Tasker or the Alexander technique petitioned Alexander to send teachers, really they wanted Irene Tasker to open a training course. And we also have Alexander's reply to that. And I think it's very interesting also because there are arguments in there that come up again and again. And there we have, at least at the time, what Alexander was replying to those arguments.
And it shows how Irene was very loyal to Alexander, although she obviously had her disagreements with him. She was intensely loyal to him and very principled.
Yeah, she was extremely principled, and she was, I would say, she was very loyal. She was extremely loyal to the Alexander technique. She was valuing Alexander very much, which also, I think, in the notebooks, for example, one also, because it spans a number, or both span a number of years, and she, having her own practice already, being very successful independently in South Africa, she comes again and again, she comes back to Alexander and she notes down how much she's getting out of these lessons and how valuable they are. I think that is a valuable, important primary source for this, because that was something written down at the time by herself, not to be published. So that she wrote that down for herself. So that wasn't something, that's totally unbiased. So she valued Alexander very much. But as you say, they had their differences. She was not afraid to stand up to him.
But there was a great respect between the two of them, obviously, both ways.
Yeah. So they, despite some differences, they kept a very friendly and respectful relationship. So, yeah.
Well, good. Thank you very much. That's all really interesting. Gives us a few insights into the background and your working process with the book. So thank you very much. And as we say, the book is available is it still available in paperback and in hardback?
Hardback running low, but still available, and in paperback still available.
So the paperback edition, and it's available from Mourit's online shop. And thank you very much, Regina.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.